20 years ago, the largest expansion of the European Union happened. On the 1st of May 2004, 10 countries joined the EU in what is commonly known as the Big Bang enlargement. The citizens and governments of these countries celebrated the event and hoped that in the coming decades their countries would catch up to Western Europe in terms of economic output, life quality, and strength of democratic institutions. But in the past 20 years, a lot has happened in the world and in Europe. The 2008 financial crisis affected the Union as a whole, but the new members faced greater economic challenges than the more mature economies of Western Europe. The Eurozone crisis, beginning in 2009, hit not only the economies of the states that adopted the common currency, but that of the whole EU. Soon after the end of the debt crisis, Europe had to face a new challenge: mass immigration. The 2015 refugee crisis shook up the Union's political landscape, strengthening the far right. 3 years ago, the world was in the middle of a pandemic which freezed our globalized economy and gave further space to political extremism. And now, a war rages on the doorstep of the Union, which again challenges the economies of the member states and creates political discord. In this video, we will be taking a look at the 8 countries from Central Eastern Europe who joined the Union 20 years ago in 2004. These nations all experienced an enforced one-party system during the Cold War and hoped to join the West after they regained their freedom in the late 80s and early 90s. In the following parts, we will be examining how this Central Eastern European 8 measures up in economy, life quality and democracy to the EU 15, which are the countries that were part of the Union before 2004. Economics is probably the least controversial and most objective subject that can be examined. Since joining the EU, the region has received large amounts of investment and EU funding, which combined with the hard work of the populations of these countries has resulted in impressive economic growth. However, due to differences in comparative advantages and national economic policies among the CEE 8 countries, deviations have occurred in the level of success achieved by each over the past 20 years. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is the sum of consumption, investment, government expenditures, and the difference between exports and imports. If we divide it by the population and adjust for inflation and different price levels, we get an indicator that can be used to compare the economies of different nations on a mostly level playing field. In 2004, our group of 8 countries reached 47% of the EU 15's average. The period leading up to the financial crisis was exceptionally favorable for the new member states, as this indicator had already risen to 55% by 2008. Since then, growth has slowed down a bit and the figure now stands at 65% according to the latest data. As I mentioned earlier, some countries fare better in catching up than others. Poland, for example, is a definite success story in this regard. In 2004, together with Latvia, the country only reached 38% of the EU's average, but today this number has risen to 64%, surpassing Slovakia and Hungary in the process. Hungary is also an outlier, but in a different manner. In 2004, the Central European country was on par with Estonian economic strength and comfortably ahead of Slovakia, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. Today, Lithuania and Poland are ahead of Hungary, while Latvia and Slovakia have narrowed down their gap in GDP from 10 to 4%. Another crucial indicator for comprehending the level of development within an economy is labor productivity, which is calculated by dividing GDP by the total hours worked by the population. To put it simply, this indicator filters out growth that is solely due to an expanding workforce or extended individual work hours and shows us the contribution of other inputs such as innovation, education, and infrastructure. Our countries have made similar progress in this aspect to their GDP growth, moving from 48 to 64% of the EU 15's average. GDP and productivity are of course important macroeconomic indicators, but they do not provide insights into the structure of an economy. While in this video we don't have time to delve deeply into all of our countries' economies, fortunately there are indicators we can use to get more insight, most notably the Economic Complexity Index. The Observatory for Economic Complexity developed 3 different indicators: the Economic Complexity Index for trade, technology, and research. On the OEC's website there is a handy example demonstrating how these different indicators complement each other, comparing the countries of Slovakia and Australia. In terms of the complexity of trade, the former ranks at a respectable 19th place, while the latter is only 84th. Does this mean that Slovakia is more advanced than Australia? No, of course not. This is shown by the other two indicators, where Australia vastly outperforms the small Central European country, meaning that Slovakia's bustling trade is not due to its innovations or technology, but to being a small and economically open country with access to the European common market, where some of the most innovative countries and best researchers are also located. The case of Slovakia is more or less true for all of our countries, and if you look at the data, we can deduce that the impressive economic and productivity growth seen in the region heavily relies on the continuing inflow of foreign direct investments from more developed countries. This is of course not a problem in itself, but if these countries want to catch up, sooner or later they will need to have internationally successful brands and businesses of their own who, unlike foreign ones, invest their profits and create high value adding jobs locally. All in all, we can say that the CEE8 countries have successfully transformed into advanced economies, and in the coming years it is expected that they will continue closing the gap to Western Europe in measures such as GDP per capita and productivity. Because of this, some refer to these countries as the growth motors of the EU, but the region might lose this title if they do not invest more in research, education, and innovation. Economic might can be a crucial factor in a country's success in the international scene, but indicators such as GDP per capita or productivity do not necessarily reflect well-being. A good example for this is the decade-long stagnation of the quality of life of the American middle class. Fortunately, there are endless statistics that can be used to determine the life quality of ordinary people. Exploring all of them is impossible, but we are going to take a look at a few connected to income, health, education, and happiness. Starting with income. The median equalized net income per household, adjusted for purchasing power, is a great indicator for comparing our countries. But this might need a bit of explanation first. Median is the value separating the higher half from the lower half of the data sample, so in our case, it means that half of the households in the given country earn less than that and half earn more. Median gives a more representative picture than average because the distribution of income does not create a bell curve when visualized, but rather something like this, where most people earn below the mathematical average. Equalized means the data is adjusted for differences in household size and composition, meaning that for example a one-person household can be compared this way to a household with 2 parents and 2 children. And finally, PPS, or Purchasing Power Standard, is an artificial common reference currency unit which eliminates the differences of price levels between countries. So a PPS allows one to buy the same volume of goods and services in all countries, thus making income comparable between them. Now that the definitions are out of the way, let's look at the data. Somewhat surprisingly, the median income growth even outpaced GDP growth in our group of countries, rising from 38% in 2005 to 67% in 2022. Similarly to the GDP per capita data, there are some outliers here too. The best performer was Lithuania, where the median income rose by 370%, closely followed by its neighbor Estonia with 360%. On the other end of the spectrum, we find Hungary again, where the increase was less than 200%. To be fair, this is also true for Slovenia, but the ex-Yugoslav country was already on par with such countries as Spain and Greece in 2006, and by now it even surpassed Italy in this statistic. Education is a defining part of everyone's life. A good educational system is inclusive, prepares students for everyday life, and helps them to explore and study their interests. Measuring these aspects in an internationally comparable way is hard, if not impossible, but there is one indicator that can indirectly show whether the quality of an educational system is good or bad. The percentage of the population of a country who attain tertiary education can indicate whether the education system of a country is accessible for people from all social backgrounds, aids students in finding their field of interest, and prepares them to study more complex subjects in greater depth. If we look at this indicator, we can see that every country in Europe made good progress in this regard, but our 8 countries can be divided into 2 groups. The Baltic countries and Slovenia are on par with Western Europe, but the V4 countries are still catching up. A somewhat surprising outlier here is Czechia, which alongside Slovenia is the most developed country of our group in many ways, but in this statistic it lags behind. A country's health can be evaluated by many statistics, such as waiting times at hospitals, doctors per capita, or the prevalence of death by certain causes. All these can be extremely important, but different healthcare systems have different strengths and weaknesses, so picking only a few of these datasets could be misleading. Instead, we are going to compare the life expectancy of these countries based on the premise that the healthier a population is, the longer it lives. Of course, this method also has flaws. Life expectancy can depend on factors that cannot be easily changed by a government, such as eating and drinking habits or the climate. The gap in life expectancy between our two groups of countries seems relatively small compared to economic differences, but from a more humanistic viewpoint, having 4 to 5 extra years in your life when you can enjoy your retirement is significant. As it is visible on our graph here, our 8 countries started off from very different baselines, but all of them are slowly but surely closing the gap in this metric to Western Europe. Finally, let's look at something less concrete: happiness. In the end, one's overall feeling of well-being cannot be only described by how much they earn or how long they live, and I think most of us would accept a lower salary if that meant we can be happier and more satisfied in our everyday lives. The World Happiness Report is based on individuals' own assessments of their lives on a 1 to 10 scale, but unsurprisingly, measures such as GDP per capita, social support, freedom, and others have a significant correlation with the results. The report was first published in 2012, so unfortunately we can see the progress of our 8 countries in the first 8 years of their time in the EU. Regardless, there are clear trends to be seen. In most Western European countries, the happiness of the people mostly stagnated, but in Central Eastern Europe, people were generally getting happier, even in the very turbulent past 3 years. Thanks to this, they have reached 94% of the happiness level of the West, compared to 80% in 2012. To sum it up, it is good to see that the impressive economic growth in the region did not solely benefit Western companies, but actually resulted in higher life quality for local populations. Of course, this doesn't mean that everything is just great in these countries, or that the average Pole, Hungarian, Slovakian can now live like an average German, but the gap is smaller than ever. Last but not least, let's talk about freedom, democracy, and corruption. Democracy and freedom are the fundamental values of the EU, and all members must enforce laws that protect them. Corruption, on the other hand, is of course something undesired by most people, but it thrives in places where the principles of democracy and freedom are neglected. Of course, these things cannot be objectively measured, because there is no perfect democracy. Freedom can mean different things to different people, and corruption, well, if done right, it stays mostly hidden. Despite all this, the 3 indexes we will examine in this chapter are still important ones. They are not perfect, they can be criticized, but arguably they are still the best indicators for comparing countries in these areas. Let's start out with freedom. For this, we will be using the Freedom in the World Index created by the US-based think tank Freedom House. This report uses 25 indicators grouped into 7 categories to evaluate the strength of political rights and civil liberties present in a country. The combined score of these indicators ranges from 0 to 100, where 100 is the best possible score and 0 is the worst. 20 years ago, in 2004, all our countries were considered free by the organization, and they were also on a good trajectory to catch up to Western Europe. Unfortunately, around the 2008 financial crisis, the rise in the level of freedom stopped. In general, stagnation or slow regression has become the trend in both of our groups, but in Central Europe there are 2 big outliers: Hungary and Poland. In both countries, the start of the drop coincides with right-wing populist parties coming to power. Problematic subjects include concerns around the rule of law, discriminations against the LGBT+ community, and suppression of critical voices. In the case of Hungary, the fairness of the elections and the lack of democratic checks and balances are also criticized by the report, and since 2019 it is considered only partly free. In Poland, things might change for the better, since the new government elected in 2023 set out to remedy these problems among others. The Democracy Index, created in 2006 by the UK-based economist group, uses 60 indicators to rate countries on a 0 to 10 scale, where 10 means the perfect democracy and 0 the most authoritarian regime. The questions can be grouped to 5 categories, which are similar to Freedom House's, so it is not surprising that parallel patterns emerge. It was in 2014 when the average democracy rating of the Central Eastern European countries was closest to the old member states, and since then the gap remained mostly constant due to both groups becoming slightly less democratic on average. Hungary, again, is an outlier. While the other countries had on average a 2% drop in their indexes compared to 2006, Hungary experienced a 12% decrease. Now from this data, we can see that the deterioration of democratic institutions is not unique to the region, but it seems that the Eastern and Central European countries are more vulnerable in this matter than their Western counterparts. And last but not least, let's talk about corruption. The Corruption Perception Index, published by Transparency International, tries to estimate corruption in the public sector, for example bribery, diversion of public funds, or nepotistic appointments in civil service. It does not include private sector corruption, such as tax fraud or money laundering. The evaluation is created with the help of selected business people and country experts who rate the given country on a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 equals the highest level of received corruption and 100 the lowest. Again, the unbiasedness of this rating can be questioned, but it is also important not to be complete cynics who brush away everything which does not align with their own perceptions and ideas about the world. Due to different methodologies, values of this index before 2012 cannot be compared year on year, so for the whole time period we are going to compare only the worst rank of our countries. On the average, in 2004, the EU 15 ranked around 18th in the world, while the CEE 8 was only 48th. In 2023, the former ranked around 19th place and the latter around 42nd. From this, one could assume that Central Eastern Europe is making progress in this regard. This is technically true, but if we take a look at the scores of the countries, we can see that in the past couple of years, the level of corruption stagnated in both groups, and the better ranking of the CEE 8 is mostly thanks to the growth of corruption in other countries. The past 20 years have proven to be an economically successful period for Central Eastern European countries, and this growth also benefited the citizens of these nations who enjoy a higher life quality than ever. However, problems connected to freedom and democracy have also developed during this time. The rise of populism, extremism, misinformation, and the growing political divide between people is not exclusive to the region, but these young democracies seem to be more vulnerable in this regard. This increased exposedness is also true for other challenges that the developed world must face, such as aging society, the housing crisis, high inflation, and others. It is questionable whether the Central Eastern European nations can successfully surmount these challenges and catch up to their much more prosperous neighbors in the coming decades. The key to this would be to stop the brain drain with focusing investment into education and research and development, and to foster the growth of strong, medium-sized and international companies. This sounds very straightforward, but the growing political divide between people and the lack of political consensus on long-term goals between competing political parties makes it harder to implement strategies that only pay off in the long run. To solve this, the people of these countries need to create a consensus regarding these key topics and then hold their political leaders to account, even if they happen to support them in general.